Hello, everyone. I'm Natasha Ryan with the North Group, and I am the host of this podcast, Time to Head North. I'm also the VP of Communications, former news anchor. So this allows me, Erin, to keep my foot in the interview storytelling part of the game that I so love and enjoy. And I have Dr. Erin Carlin here with me today. So excited to have you. Thank you for being on.
Thank you very much for having me. Really excited to do this and to talk to everyone today. Talk to you.
And you have a wealth of knowledge. So I kind of want to tell you why we have Erin on is because anyone that knows the North Group knows we have developed a training program called Situational Awareness for Everyone. And the mission was to curb violent assaults, attacks, encounters in every sort of corporate setting, healthcare setting, but especially in schools, right? Because we are tired of seeing the mass violence. And to be able to create a training program, it requires collecting a massive amount of intelligence, right? All the data, all the stats. And this is where Dr. Carlin is fascinating to us here at the North Group because you are a master of this. So I want you to introduce yourself and tell everyone where you're at, what you do, where you came from, all the things, please.
So again, Erin Carlin, and I am an assistant professor of national security studies within the Department of Criminal Justice, as well as the Institute for National Security and Military Studies at Austin Peay State University. And we're this is the end of our second year of the existence of our major in our institute. This was kind of like Tennessee's answer to creating a national security program, the first national security program in the Southeast at a public university, because for so long the Southeast had kind of not been represented in that field or area. So that was a very happy moment for me. As far as my own research, I look at both domestic and international crises, crisis mitigation, even like conflict mediation internationally and in civil wars. But active shooter incidents was really important to me for a multitude of reasons that I know we've discussed, and I'm happy to share more about that.
And I'm happy to ask the questions. Okay, so for the non-security experts who happen to be listening, a question I always get is, do we think this has become more of an epidemic, or is it just more publicized now, right? So basic question, let's start there, Dr. Carlin.
In looking at some of the trends, and I will say, let me back up and share this a moment. Maybe this might be helpful. So for viewers, a lot of times you will hear these public shootings called mass shooting attacks, right? Mass incidents, mass killings. We are very close to that with our research, but we use the FBI's term of active shooting incidents. And this carves away any of the purely crime related or gang related incidents to get at those that actually target the public. And then within those, we subdivide the attacks into different venue types, which is something that is a bit more unusual. The FBI does this, but then we really dig into those venue types and then the subtypes. I share all this because in answering whether or not we have seen a rise in these attacks, I would say in some cases it depends on the spaces. With school shootings, they dropped off, of course, during the COVID pandemic because people were at home. Right. And they've actually, believe it or not, just kind of remained very rare and very just steady. I would say, seen more of a rise in commercial attacks and in open space attacks. And sorry, whenever I say commercial, I mean like commercial retail, but places that are open to the public as well as those that are close to the public with private businesses. So there's been more of a turn, especially since COVID, there's been more of a turn to those spaces. Attacks on religious institutions and houses of worship, that's remained steady, but we've seen some scary numbers with a few of those. So those are some of the overall trends. And I will say that healthcare settings and government settings are also rare, but combining like government and open space, we're also seeing with political polarization, like a rise in outdoor political events where we have attacks.
So let's dive into where do you attribute the increase? Like, what's the reasoning behind the increase in retail, like commercial increase of shootings? What are you attributing that to at the moment?
I would say just overall, and this combines like information from some other researchers too, but I would say overall what we're seeing is an increase in political polarization, a great lack sometimes in mental health resources. And then whenever we enter into times whenever people are very financially stressed or they're losing their jobs and they're let go at work, you will see a lot more incidents where they turn around and target the workplace. And one of the things that's noted by like Peterson and Dinsley, who wrote the Violence Project, is that you'll see situations to where people all of a sudden, not only have they lost their job, but they've probably had relationship issues at home that have accompanied this job loss. And then on top of that, they lose their health care insurance a lot of times whenever they're let go at work. And with that, access to mental health care. So there's no one that maybe they can turn to or they think they can turn to through their insurance in a crisis of how do I navigate all of this happening at once to me.
And as I'm sitting here listening to you, I'm going to ask you to pull out your crystal ball here based on your knowledge and stats. None of these things are set to subside or decrease. In fact, they're only increasing, right? The polarization, especially with the Israel situation, like and the mental health resources, we all know it has not gotten better, and you know, the economy, like where do you see this all going? I mean, what can we expect in like track the next 5 years?
I will be really curious, just again, doing a walk through these, I will be really curious to look at what happens in a few of these spaces. I think that we're focusing a lot on schools and how we make schools more secure. But even beyond that, we have implemented some mental health care programs and early alerts with students, red flag or yellow flag laws where someone can alert law enforcement that a person is of potential risk to others or harming others or whatever, or even sometimes, harming themselves. Those kind of laws, I think, will be interesting to see, how they play out in the school setting. I do think that they might somewhat be helpful there, but I will say that some of the data is a little bit too early for us to determine on that. One of the things that we have seen with schools is a implementation of text-to-tip programs where other students can text in anonymously information that someone has a gun in the school or someone has been making threats against the school. And yes, you might have some false reporting that administration or authorities have to sort through, but I will say that would have maybe been key in preventing a live shooting that happened at the school where I taught. And I know we'll get more into that. If we pivot, though, to workplaces, sometimes places of higher education, we don't see as much of implementation of those text-to-tip, like text-to-tip programs where employees can do this as well. Mm-hmm. I think that's someplace in the workplace or something in the workplace that we are really missing out on that we might want to consider. I also see too, as you were mentioning, the increased political polarization with inflation, what it is, and with, again, lack of implementation of mental health resources, especially like if you have to let someone go, maybe saying, hey, there's people that you can talk to or turn to, or your benefits are going to extend for so many days, maybe without the exorbitant cost of COBRA. I don't know. But I think a lot of that, again, with workplaces, I'm afraid that we're going to see a rise of incidents there without implementation of some mitigation programs.
Let's jump into the other component of this, right? On the prevention side, mitigation side is, again, what we push is training employees to not only know where to escalate things to, but recognize the signs. How important is training like that in the grand scheme of things in actually putting a dent on the stats?
I think it is really important, first off, like I said, to have some sort of program or way that employees can anonymously alert HR or law enforcement or whoever that someone is making threats. I have dealt with, experience of this in the school setting where a student was making threats and students felt uncomfortable about sharing that with administration because they were afraid of retribution if the person found out that they had revealed information. But I know my mother works as a healthcare administrator, and that was one of the ways that they prevented a potential active shooting at their workplace, was that someone was making threats and talking about how he would like to target a place where people couldn't fight back. For example, or as he quoted, like, for example, a school or maybe a nursing home. And he was actually working in a nursing home. So it was these kind of statements to employees that got turned into administration. Law enforcement was alerted. They went to his place and there were guns, there were plans. We see this too, like with multiple people who are planning an incident, which is why they don't often succeed, where you have more than just like the lone wolf attacker.
Yeah.
Usually somebody talks too much.
Leakage.
Exactly. Leakage. Somebody talks too much, and because of that, other people, as the warning goes, if you see something, say something. Well, that's what they do.
Yes.
So that to me is absolutely number one. And then you want to combine it with, again, mental health options for individuals. Like I know at some universities, they allow for, even at ours, they allow for 10 mental health emergency visits or whatever through healthcare without like you can call in 24/7.
Yeah.
There's mental health helplines. But then I think that there are also further considerations, which again, we can talk about, but like with worry over workers that have a potential domestic violence situation at home, a rise of incel groups, and also carry over from young people who maybe had these ideas in mind when they were in high school, but then decided not to act on them in high school because they were waiting to see if life got better beyond high school, and then it didn't. So we're seeing some of those groups like hold over, and then they'll end up attacking retail or commercial spaces.
Okay. One thing I kind of want to get into, I'm excited to hear, your personal journey and your connection to this and you living through an incident. Just really quickly, I think it's fascinating when we dove into the research. I think people think you can very much pigeonhole what an active shooter is going to look like. And I was kind of blown away by some of it, right? Because the resounding statistics are a lot of these shooters have no mental health issues. They are just set on a plan and they're going to carry it out. Can you talk to that? Because that to me is one of the most common misnomers about it.
So with young people that we hear so much about in the news, because we hear a lot about school-based incidents in the news. With young people, we talk about childhood trauma or ACEs, and that it's not that ACEs predict that a person will attack. It's kind of backwards, to be clear, that those who have attacked usually have so many ACEs, so many traumatic experience types that they have gone through, like being abused as a child, or going through some sort of extreme poverty or homelessness. So a lot of these add up. Whenever you turn to adults, again, it's not usually that even a primary factor is some sort of great mental health disturbance. That happens in like less than 10% of individuals. It's more so that they have experienced adult traumas. And I will even say, like in the commercial retail setting, and Peterson and Dinsley talk more about this, but in the commercial retail setting, there's a combination that goes on too of a rise of incidents in areas where there are a lot of blue collar workers, and people are very dependent upon one main industry in town. And they feel like if they lose their livelihood, or maybe something at home is affecting them, and then they carry it over to work and that causes problems, then they end up feeling like they've lost everything. Right. So they might not have those child traumas. They might not have mental health issues. Like I said, that's very rare. But it's these adult traumas that you see more often.
Okay, so let's go into your personal connection to all of this. You actually were in a shooting scenario. Walk us through what that was like.
Before I became a college professor, I spent 6 years as a high school teacher in East Tennessee. And at the school where I taught, we ended up having a live shooting incident where, unfortunately, a young man was shot and killed during breakfast hours, as students were still coming into the school and walking back out to the parking lot areas. So there was a lot of flow of students. And I say this first off because I was one of the rare individuals that during my teaching training, we had actually had training for what to do in an active shooting incident. I had graduated from a college in a different area than most of the other individuals that I taught with. And most of them had never gone through, like I said, any such training. So we had always been told in our training that whenever there is an incident, the first alert that you have, you're going to have about 15 seconds or less to get into your classroom, get everybody in that you can, lock the doors, and then don't open it for anyone until you get an all clear and it's law enforcement that shows up. And you need the all clear, you need to know that it is law enforcement. And there's very specific protocols with that. But all of these preparations were for the idea that you were already in the classroom or you were already in the hallways, that the school day had already begun. There was no thought of what happens if people are still coming and going at the beginning of the day or at the end of the day. And we know at the beginning of the day is one of the high times whenever active shooters like to attack schools. So I heard, as I was standing in the courtyard, what was just akin to, it sounded like somebody had just dropped a heavy textbook on a flat surface on the ground. Like on the linoleum or something, that it just snapped.
Okay.
And with that, I will say, and you see this in a lot of the good training videos, there's that initial confusion of people aren't sure what they heard. They don't know what's going on. It's not an immediate running, people panicking, screaming. It's confusion of what has happened. And so for probably the first minute or so, I saw a student weaving through the crowd coming out of the cafeteria area into the courtyard where I was. And he was just walking up to small groups of students sharing that someone had been shot. Or did you know someone had been shot? And I didn't know if he was talking about the weekend beforehand.
Yeah.
Yeah. They did not come over the intercom to give the code words that someone had been shot at the school. One of the first things that we learn in emergency and risk management is to anticipate all communication breaks down in an emergency or a disaster. And I will say that's very true, because in that, I guess, mental panic, that's what you think of. You also think of, beyond reacting, that you personally don't want to cause a panic because you're afraid, what if I am the one that, like, I misinterpret this, cause a panic or a stir across the
That's right.
school.
Yeah.
It ends up on the news. Parents find out my career is over. Like, you want to be sure in that immediate reaction. I had a principal come through. I said, has a shooting happened? He said, yes. Get the students into the rooms. And there I stood. And I just fell back on that training of grab as many around me as I could and tell them to get to my classroom. People talk about like running. There was no even thought of running out to the parking lot. It was just, you really do fall back on training.
I find that fascinating. Like, you are describing a play-by-play that is so far from my vision of what I think it would look like in that scenario.
There is a researcher out there, and I apologize as I don't know the name off the top of my head at the moment, but there's a researcher out there that has looked at how people evacuate in disasters. And they utilize cameras in this as well as mock situations. But what they find is that usually people will exit the way they came in instead of the way that they're supposed to go. So they'll exit the building the way they came in, no matter how much congestion it might cause.
Just habitual, probably.
But that's the whole part about training too. It becomes ingrained in you, of almost like a knee-jerk reaction, just like those habits of how you enter and exit.
Yeah.
Of what you're supposed to do. And if you don't practice it multiple times, you might not act accordingly. But yes, that was my first thought, was grab the students, get them into the classroom, lock down the classroom, barricade it. Well, I'm sorry, barricading had not been advised yet. I said, we barricade now.
Right.
But, turn out the lights, make it look like no one's in the room. So you have all those protocols that you follow. And I will add one more to that. That was what we did. Had about 35, 40 students in the classroom, hunkered down, trying to keep them quiet. Of course, people try not to cry, try not to panic, but trying to keep them quiet. And we went for 5 hours with no news, and the suspect was loose on campus. They were trying to chase him down, but he was hiding in different places. This would, I call it a live shooting because it wouldn't normally be classified, or it wouldn't have then been classified as an active shooting because only one individual was directly targeted. It would have been very easy in those circumstances for him to just suddenly decide, instead of shooting this one young man, that he was going to pivot the gun on others because everybody was crowded and standing around the pair of them whenever this took place in the cafeteria.
So as you're standing in the courtyard, I would have to imagine school shootings are rare. I would have to imagine in your head trying to connect the dots of this actually happening in the school you were standing in. That had to have been a surreal moment for you.
As strange as it sounds, maybe afterwards, but in the moment, and maybe this comes from having family in healthcare.
Yeah.
And having been a candy striper and worked in the emergency rooms and all that, but you just react.
Yeah.
I don't think that everybody reacts the same necessarily.
Yeah. How did your co-teachers react?
Whenever I went, and I actually took the students upstairs to my classroom, not the smartest thing to do. But again, you're falling back to that training of where do you go? You go to your classroom. But also in my mind, at that moment of whether to go into someone else's classroom or upstairs, I thought that if the incident took place in the cafeteria, that the individual, if they ran in anywhere, they would run into the bottom floors and not into the top floors necessarily. That was more out of the way. So that's, one of the reasons why I went back to my classroom. Whenever I got up there, we had our first announcement come across the intercom that said for the students to report to their first period classes immediately. Now, this was confusing because, again, the secret code phrase didn't come across the intercom. So none of the teachers knew that it was an actual active shooter lockdown. Teachers were standing out in the hallways. They were asking what's going on. They were still like prepping for morning classes. And so they were like, what's going on? Why are the students reporting early? I'm still trying to get things finished. They were directing students who were already in the hallways to leave and go like to the other ends of the school, which
this would have gone really, I'm listening to everything that failed that day. And this could have been much, much worse.
Yes. They were directing them to, like I said, to report to their first block classes, which, like I said, some of which were at the other end of the school and would have caused them to have to pass by the cafeteria unless they went around the outside. So, again, in that moment, you wonder, what is the line of what I'm supposed to do to kind of disobey orders versus, tell students to no, go on, do what they say. And there were a few split-second decisions where I just started saying, no, don't go. Just get in my classroom. We'll deal with it afterwards. And then I told the few people in the vicinity around me what they were saying downstairs had occurred, that there had been a shooting. And we went ahead, my students and I, we shut the door, locked it, had the lights out, and were huddled and quiet. And we could still hear doors opening and closing, people in the hallways. I mean, it was, I could not exactly explain or tell you how much longer it went on, but it was definitely several minutes at least.
What was that post-incident debrief like?
Well, interestingly, like I said, we were in there for 5 hours, and they tell you to keep students off the phones and keep the phones turned off. And sometimes they'll say that it's like to prevent like a possible triggering if there was anyone that had planted a bomb or anything. That's mostly what you hear. That's very rare, especially like coming from a student. More so what they want people to stay off the phones for two purposes. You want to keep sound to a minimum because you're hiding.
Right.
The other reason too is you don't want the shooter taking someone hostage and it being a situation where they have a hit list and they say, call such and such and ask them where they're at.
Yeah.
So yeah, you keep them off the phones. But what people don't think about is that these young people, they have potential parents in the building, grandparents, cousins, brothers, sisters, of course, boyfriends, girlfriends, close friends. They have other individuals that they're extremely worried about in other parts of that building. And they're also desperate to let their parents know that they are okay. So after a while, with zero news and still zero phrase alert that this is an active shooting incident, as far as like the code phrase,
right?
With zero, I do not fully recall if they did come across at any point and just outright say that there has been a shooting. I think they might have, but it was like an elimination. If they did, it was an elimination of any of the code phrases. So we could hear in the rooms next door, students moving around, students loud, people with TVs on, wanting to know what was going on. And my students were asking me why we couldn't also talk. And I had to tell them, I said, because this is what we're supposed to do in an active shooting incident. And you all are mine. And I'll care about all the students here at the school, but you're mine, and I'm going to protect you first. And they will go to the other rooms where they hear people.
Wow. I can't, I'm having such a disbelief that it like something as simple as coming over the loudspeaker, alerting everyone didn't happen. That kids weren't told to evacuate the campus if they were already outside, right? All of the things we now really drive home seem to be completely absent in that incident you were involved in. So did you leave there just going, I mean, you seem like a calm person, obviously, by nature, as you've already said, because even telling this story, if I were in your position, I'd be like, and then, and relive those moments. I mean, did you just walk away thinking, A, I can't believe that didn't go down a lot worse, and B, there needs to be a massive change inside these walls?
I did feel that could have gone down a lot worse. And let me say this, let me wrap it up with, you asked about the debrief, and this kind of all connects together. Of after we had been in there so many hours, and of course this went through the lunch hour too, but after we'd been in there so many hours, the students started asking if they could let their parents know that they were okay. And that really hit me first. I didn't want to let them on the phones and then it start getting very noisy, but I told them that they could keep their phones on silent, turn their phones on, and text their parents. I said, that's definitely reasonable to me, but I said, don't get on the phone and start making any noise because we still don't know any news. And it was from that contact with parents that eventually we would learn that the individual had been caught. And finally, we would turn on the news in the classroom, and it was still probably another hour or so before, maybe an hour and a half before we were given the all clear. And then it was a massive, just like leaving the school. Students were leaving the school. We were leaving the school. They ended up, I can't remember if it was for a day or two, canceling classes. And then whenever we came back, there was, there were kind of, descriptions of about like talking to media of what you should and should not do as far as your job goes. And there were also counselors. And I think we might have had, one faculty meeting, but and I will give this to administration. They were very torn up about everything as well. They were there with the young man who was shot, and it was not good. We lost him, so it was really tough. There was a lot of self-blame. There was a lot of blame, not only with the administration but also with us teachers and with the students. We had students who were scared and had a lot of PTSD afterwards and even years afterwards. But for like the immediate, I guess, effect beyond that, it was students saying the suspect had, said certain words to them, or he had shown them a gun at some point in the last 2 weeks or the 2 weeks prior. And I think I might have heard him say this, or I think I might have heard him say that. So there was a lot of guilt and self-blame. But definitely, too, that whole, yes, you look back and you realize how this could have gone a lot worse.
What's it, I've been in situations, right, in the news business where you're at the scene and something violent happens and you kind of go home and just go, wow, I was really close to that, I've never seen someone get shot. I've seen the aftermath of that, but not the actual action. What's it like to not only go home that night and wrap your head around it, but also then have to go back into the environment on a personal level? What was that like?
Strangely, unlike a lot of people, I wasn't scared. I don't know if it was faith or calm, and not to get into that, but I had a peace about it and of knowing what to do in an emergency. And so, yes, strangely, I was not scared when I went back. The only time I would say that I was scared was whenever the suspect escaped at one point and ended up within a block of our school again, about within a year and a half of the initial incident and him being incarcerated. There was a panic then. But yes, going back, it was more so a concern for the students. And rather than, like I said, being scared, it was also a lot of self-blame. The suspect was in one of my classes. And I had thought I had heard something that he said one day, just a few days beforehand, and it really bothered me of if I should have done more. But you hear students say so much, like so much, as we say, yang, or
Yeah.
threats, or they're going to beat somebody up, they're going to do this, they're going to do that. I mean, you could be sending students to the office all day long for that. So every time that while I was teaching that I thought I might have heard him say something, and I would kind of slow down or I would take a pause, he would stop and he wouldn't say anymore. Yeah. And so I was really trying to catch exactly what it was that he was saying or threatening, but I couldn't fully.
So did you ever try to have a conversation with this student, post class, to try to see what you had heard or what was going on?
As far as like with the suspect or with, so I did not have a conversation with the suspect, but I will tell you that I asked someone involved in the investigation that interviewed me, and I won't reveal exactly who on that, just out of professional protection to them. But I said, has this suspect, this student, had any remorse over the incident? And the person said, no. You could tell that they were really, really worn out with the investigation. And they said, no. And they said, there is no remorse. And this individual just comes across as an absolute cold-blooded killer. He does not care. And I don't know how much of that, that we see out of individuals later on down the road, if they still hold to that whenever young people commit like active shooting incidents or live shooting incidents in schools. That's not one area that we've really delved into yet. But on the far aftermath, I won't necessarily say I have PTSD, but I do have certain tics. I really, really, really don't like to be in a classroom where the door is open or where it does not lock. We hear a lot of that with active shooting incidents, that people were trying to lock the door to a room where they were hiding to keep the suspect out, and the door wouldn't lock, or they didn't have keys, or the lock was broken.
This goes back to, from a security perspective, right?
Mm-hmm.
Staying on top of your facilities, assessing risk, putting measures in place to mitigate the risk, and sticking to it, right? And not just doing it once every 5 years. You've got to stay on it,
If I might add to that, since you said that about with businesses staying on top of risk mitigation, I think that maybe one major frustration I have of what I see in active shooting research, but also in like implementation of mitigation plans to prevent these or to control how bad a situation becomes. I see so many situations to where companies do not want to implement drills, policies, or whatever, like to respond to an active shooting incident or to prevent it. We hear things like they're afraid to scare people. You see situations to where they don't, like I said, want to necessarily expose blind spots or weaknesses in their security. Also, there are situations where you don't want to necessarily train everyone, because like even with training teachers versus students, you don't necessarily want the students to know what the safety plan is, because a lot of your shooters in middle school and high school, not in elementary school, but in middle school and high school, it's students. And so you you don't want them to know like how you're going to hide, what you're going to do in those incidents. But I know where I taught then, and I've seen this elsewhere since, there were a lot of cries from like the safety and security team that we needed to do some drills, implement some plans, teach it to others about how to respond. We needed to bring in someone to teach us what to do. And those, like I've seen in many other places, those were some of the excuses of don't expose the weaknesses, don't scare people. And it's so rare it wouldn't happen here.
Yep. We hear the same things. And I always say if I had $1 from my 2 decades in the news business for everyone that said, I never thought this could happen to me. I never thought this would happen here. I thought we were safe. We thought our school was safe. No one is immune. No one. Mm-hmm. And this is why we have conversations like this repeatedly and frequently, because just because you bury your head doesn't mean it can't happen to you. It just means when that moment strikes, you could have potentially done something to have mitigated it and not be in that situation, or you're going to be caught completely off guard and unprepared.
I would go so far as to say, in the incidents that we have looked at, the vast majority of these perpetrators, they're students that attack their schools. Again, though, this is not every level of school, though. Like we see a lot of outsiders, or most cases at elementary schools, it's an outsider, someone that's not a student or a faculty or staff member. But students tend to attack their schools. Adults, especially those that are around 34 and older, they tend to attack their workplaces. There's a bit of a lag there, and I can talk about that age gap, but they tend to attack their workplaces. And then with a lot of those individuals, they're experiencing these traumas that I shared with you. With the workplace, they tend to feel that they have been, slighted in some way. They were reprimanded or fired when they believe they shouldn't have been, or somebody did something else to them at the workplace and they finally have had enough. Maybe it was constantly making fun of them or mistreating them in the workplace, and it just mounted and mounted and mounted. It wasn't something small, it was a lot. Pulling back from this then, and this is something I think that businesses should definitely be aware of that we don't talk about as much, is we also see a lot of incidents where it is domestic violence and the person comes looking for the significant other in their workplace, or sometimes they come looking for the significant other's parents, their lawyer, maybe who the significant other might have been seeing if there was a case of that going on. They will come to those places and they will target that individual, but then also spill over to other people that are in the nearby vicinity. And yeah, we need to be more aware of that. Don't just let in, I'll say Joe, but don't just let in Joe into the workplace because he's dating someone or married to someone. And then there needs to be some sort of reporting mechanism if there is a serious case of domestic violence.
And this always, right, comes back to whether it's in a workplace, in a domestic violence situation, a school, and a student who's worried, the level of comfortability to get that information to the appropriate person who can intervene, right? And especially, I would just like to add this on the domestic violence front. It's also having empathy as an employer that this is not just physical abuse that happens inside the home. This extends far beyond even the escape of that individual, because then it is they're at a financial hit. They may have to stay in a shelter. They have to show up at court dates. So it's all of the empathy and the understanding and willing to see that process through for an employee, right? It's not just a one and done. Okay, they avoided this incident or they left him. That kind of abuse can carry on and be super detrimental in the work environment. So just, I think creating that, as you said, kind of circling back to the start of the conversation, one of the most important things is, is of course the training and knowing what to look for and even signs that your coworker or student could be in a situation, but also that reporting mechanism is so important, to have the ability to be anonymous.
Yes.
And know that you're not going to get in trouble. I mean, even you, honestly, when you were in that situation, you said, I didn't want to be the teacher that cried wolf and then I have to worry about my job. We can't have that, because that's going to prevent you from alerting someone in a setting that you could have needed to say, run, right? And so I think that is just such a big component. And I'm glad that's really what you drive home through your messaging.
I would share too that with domestic violence, and I've been part of some trainings and seminars on this, and there is a lot that is going on today with reform with domestic violence reporting. Some states are really leading the way on that. And I saw this in Illinois, to where it's not just law enforcement that comes out to take statements on domestic violence, but they actually have a team that come out and handle this. And it's usually more so a therapist or a caseworker that discusses the actual domestic violence incidents with the individual. But with all this being said, in some of these trainings, one thing to note is, or in talking to people who actually run groups with domestic violence, like where people talk about this, with higher socioeconomic individuals, they are a lot more silent about this. They are afraid to lose their jobs. They're afraid for this to be exposed publicly. I know in Illinois, there was one example relayed to me. No names were given, but one example relayed to me of the person was an elected official. And the significant other held this over them because the lady knew that if she went and tried to do anything about this domestic violence situation, that it would be all over the media, or it would be all talked about in the open. Also, too, you will have situations to where that person makes some very, very real threats that they will call the workplace, and they will make up stories, or they will try to do certain things to make sure that that individual never gets to see their child. They threaten everyone. They threaten to do things to family members, or like I said, to other people that they might be connected to or care about. So it comes back to what we were saying before about that anonymous reporting mechanism, because it can be really hard for some people to give up that information.
So, Erin, ironically enough, we heard all about your school shooting experience, but that's not the only live shooting scenario you've been in. You've actually been in more than one. So now I want to switch, because we were talking about commercial versus school, and you now have experience on both sides. What happened at Osprey Hills? Did I say that right? Osprey Hills?
Albany Mills. Albany
Osprey
Mills.
Mills.
Some
Okay.
people might be, and I'm sorry, I hear an echo here. Is that?
No, you're good.
Okay. Some people might be familiar with Opryland Hotel or Opry Mills Mall in
Yes.
Nashville, Tennessee.
Yes.
So back somewhere between, and I've been trying to remember the exact dates in my head, but I worked there kind of from between around March, I think 2005 to July 2007, as I was in between getting my undergrad, but then going back and getting teaching certification.
Yes.
To go on to teach high school. So I'm in, while I'm working at Opry Mills, I'm in this teaching program, which is where, as I shared before, that I'd gone through this active shooter training, and kind of had learned what to do. And so as I'm working there at Opry Mills Mall, I'm employed at a jewelry store. And one evening, like we had had some different gang activity at the mall at different points, but one evening that I recall pretty vividly, on a weekend, we had a situation to where there was a live shooting, or so we were told. There was a live shooting in Old Navy that was just a few stores down from us. We had heard that there were 3 individuals in there potentially armed. We had heard that one person was shot, and I could not confirm, all of the details on this, but this was what was told to us by security at the time. And again, even in like this commercial retail setting, there was not this massive panic. I would say you might have seen people walking faster or trying to get to their cars, but it was not like this herd of people just running very quickly through the mall. I think we more so only see that, or in like outdoor incidents or something where, or big, like, let's say stadium or parade incidents, where people very easily can see everything that's happening, because whenever it's out of view, a lot of people are standing around wondering what's going on, trying to confirm if this is the case. So that was part of what was happening in the mall. But again, we don't think sometimes about the realities of that there are people in the mall that are separated from other members of their party, right? How many times do we go to the mall and we tell the kids or tell a spouse or whoever that I'm going to go to this store, you go down there, and I'll call you, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of that goes on, I think, in some of these retail spaces. And next door to our jewelry store, which, for the company's sake, I won't name the company that I work for, but next door to us, there was a candy store. And there was a party of young girls about 9 to 11 years of age that were there for a birthday party, or at the mall for a birthday party, but they had been dropped off at the candy store by the parents, who had gone across the hallway to a clothing store while the children picked out what they wanted to get. And then they were going to come back and pay for it. So about this time, whenever security comes through to alert us, I remember those girls were standing, they also in their curiosity had walked out into the hallway and were standing there, and you could see the panic starting to set in with a few of them, that they didn't know what to do. A couple were starting to cry. And I think there was around like 7 of them. Within our jewelry store, we had one couple that was in there, another that was kind of like walking in. And then I saw a couple that were standing near these young girls whenever we had the confirmation about the shooting. And so that training from teacher days, not from any training the mall had done, but it kicked in, and I just started grabbing the young girls, and I said, get in here. And they were saying, we don't know where my mom and dad is. They brought us here. And I said, we're going to hide, and we will find them afterwards. So get in here. We will find them. Don't worry about them. I'm going to take care of you. And so we got them behind the counters. The two couples that were kind of in the store, brought them in, asked, very quickly asked them if they wanted to stay or if they wanted to leave. And that couple who was in the hallway, I told them, I said, look, we're shutting down. We're shutting the gate within 15 seconds. Do you want in here and do you want to hide with us or do you want to go? And they said, well, hide. Very fast. You got to be quick.
Yeah.
And so that's what we did. And this was a gate that had to come down over the store. And whenever you think about those gates at the malls, this is like a porous gate that, yes, somebody could come through and start shooting. I think, too, a lot of times about the glass doors.
Yeah.
I don't know if those are bulletproof or not. But so that, I will say, did enter my mind of whenever you're trying to lock the different locks on it, somebody could easily come right up here. If they start running through the mall shooting, they could come right up here and I'm vulnerable right now.
Right. Yeah.
But got it locked down. And this is where I will come back to whenever we're talking about commercial retail and what is told to us to do in an emergency. My coworker, who is a very smart lady, but she turns to me and she says, should we take the jewelry out of the cases? Now, this might sound completely crazy of a thought, but we had a situation within that last year where there was a fire outbreak, I think, over in the food court at the mall. And there was talk of like evacuating the mall, or they may have even done so at one point. But we called our district manager of what we needed to do, that there was a fire in the mall and we didn't know exactly where. And yes, you can get the jewelry out of the cases pretty quickly. It takes about 15 minutes. But his directions were to absolutely 100% get the jewelry out of the cases into the bins and get it into the safe before getting out of there. And he actually even asked one of us if the security guard came back in or if the security guard was around, could we ask him if we could stay to put the jewelry into the cases before we left. So whenever you talk about liability and you talk about insurance and you talk about loss, these, and again, district manager who was very successful, but these are some of the things, some of the directives that gets passed down. So that was one thing I really wanted to point out that I remembered in that incident was her asking about that and the thought that she might have, just like I did, of not causing a panic in the school setting. We're not getting fired because you didn't get the jewelry out of the cases.
When there is an active shooter on the premises.
Potentially 3.
I mean, that's just mind-blowing. And, again, it goes back to understanding risk, understanding liability, that it's going to be much, and this is what I say from a PR perspective, right? It's going to be much more expensive for you on the other end with lawsuits if you choose materialistic items over life safety. It's not, right. It's not worth it.
And companies have to know what their directives are, and they have to make sure those are communicated down the line for how to respond, and not one of those of theory versus reality. Now, we're going to say on paper, this is what we're going to do, but in reality, get the jewelry out of the cases.
Right.
No, it has to be very clear, because in situations like these where, like say, people fall back to the animal brain of exactly what are we supposed to do with their training, companies can end up very, very liable if you have people in positions of authority that miscommunicate that saving the business, saving the merchandise, or whatever is more important than absolutely 100% getting to safety yourself, that you're the most important asset to that company. Kind of a copycat syndrome that we know takes effect with active shooting incidents, just mass attacks in general. And this is a growing trend that in some areas, it's a growing trend that people turn to. And I also find that it's very interesting that we probably see a disproportionate number of these events in places like Ohio and Pennsylvania. I mean, yes, of course, most events are in the most populous states, but it's kind of disproportionate there and maybe some of the Rust Belt areas, like what Peterson and Dinsley point out with maybe blue collar workers. But we also see too, Natasha, a rise in, like, we thought that left-wing terror attacks were a wave of the past, but whenever you look at houses of worship, you do see race-based targeting of Jewish synagogues. But very interestingly, something we have found that's not been hit on by anyone else to my knowledge, whenever you look at Christian denominations, there has been a large focus of active shooter attacks on evangelical denomination.
Yeah.
It tends to be more from left-wing individuals, or even sometimes people who are atheists. You do also too see domestic violence in all of that, but it's not necessarily domestic violence from someone who is part of that denomination. It's people who are angry maybe at those values. So you see more of this push sometimes from the other side in those spaces, and that's something that we're monitoring too. But yes, political polarization for sure, but still with all of that, even beyond political polarization, beyond mental health, it comes back to the traumas and job security for adults, relationship loss, proper ways to handle that. And I think that we're lacking in some ways in this country. And then we're starting to see these issues occur in new places too. We just got back for research. Well, my institute team, we just got back from Serbia not too long ago, and they just had their first school-based shooting there.
It's sad to see it. It's important to understand it. And as you said, it's all in the name of prevention and trying to, decrease the statistics and save lives, right? So, Erin, thank you so much for doing the work you're doing, A, and B, again, being on with us. Do you have any final closing thoughts here?
I would just come back to, for all businesses, all schools out there, to not let worries of safety blind spots, worries of people being or being upset or triggered by training, to hold them back on actually implementing active shooter training. And I know that whenever I was a child, and I do know there's traumatic experiences for children sometimes that go through extreme, like active shooter training or whatever. I don't necessarily think that's the best thing for them. I think it's more for the adults, the employees around. But I know as a child, I was traumatized by the tornado drills. And I was traumatized by the idea of that, what could happen if a tornado swept through our school and we're trying to get to the place to duck and cover in case one came through. But then as we grow up, we know what to do. I think probably some of the most disastrous outcomes that we see are in places where there wasn't any training, or where that training wasn't taken seriously enough to be followed, maybe because it was just a one and done and never really implemented or discussed further. And then, like you talked about too, with risk assessment, doing full risk assessments of your buildings, making sure that alarms work, that people have escape routes, that doors lock. We could go on and on through that, but Those are all very, very important.
Absolutely. You have to know what your weak spots are so that the perp can't take advantage, right? Well, if any of you would like to hear more podcast episodes, you can do that by visiting our website, tngdefense.com, or if you just want to listen, iTunes, Podbean, or Spotify. Dr. Erin Carlin, thanks again for coming on. Thanks to all of you for watching. And until next time, have a great day.